certainly is variation. Variation on a theme is the spice of life in the real world, isn't it? If everything was colored blue, it would be really boring. But these pictures of variable butterflies or variable seashells and the animals that inhabited those seashells are quite common all over the world. Variation is a good thing. But are there limits to variation? Because the idea that Darwin had was that this variation is plastic. In other words, I can take advantage of this variation and change without regard to limits from one kind of an organism into another organism. And so the question is that a valid concept? Are there limits to variability and variation within a population? Well, every breeder of any animal or plant, if you're a person who likes dogs, you're a dog breeder. Other people, breed different kinds of animals. Some people love flowers. There are limits to variation and variability. You cannot simply push an organism by artificial selection beyond its genetic boundary. So artificial selection, if you think about the idea that a wolf is probably more of a wild-type dog, that is an ancestral dog to all of our domesticated dogs, Chihuahuas, Dachshunds, Greyhounds, Mastiffs, and the hundreds of other varieties of dog, all of which are the same species, all of which are interfertile. This artificial selection process from the wolf, from a wild ancestor, may have taken 300-400 years to get to the various strange kinds of dogs that we have. Okay? It's a real thing. But it's important to know, and every breeder knows this, that each breed, each derivative, has less variation than the wild type. That is, out of the variation in the original organism, you're selecting for a small part of that variation. And oftentimes it makes their hips have problems, if we're talking about dogs, with dysplasia. It makes them open to infections. It makes them less fit, and so they have to be cared for in special ways. But this is a very well-known characteristic of limitation in breeding. Now, artificial selection cannot select for dogs with wings. Now, okay, in other words, there's a barrier there. I have no way to introduce into a dog the genetic information and the systems that would allow a dog to fly. And they don't exist in the natural population of wild dogs or wolves or any domesticated dogs. And so I can't introduce and select for something that isn't there to begin with. So you start with a range of variability and you can select from it, but you can't create whole new systems. Can't have a dog with wings. Nor can you back up and go the other direction. Nor can you take a Chihuahua and start to breed that Chihuahua back up into a wolf. Why? Because you've lost variability. You've lost information in this breeding and selection process, and you can't get it back. Right? You can breed, a Chihuahua with another kind of a dog and introduce variability that way, but it doesn't work that you can work back up the selection ladder. Now, Darwin wondered, he was very familiar with that normal kind of breeding. Darwin wondered, now can I take the person who is doing the artificial selection, can I take that person out of the equation? Can I substitute a natural process to replace the breeder? And so this was his thinking in the finch arena in the Galapagos, that finches aren't selected for by any particular breeder, but they do have wet and cold or wetter and warmer conditions, or drought conditions, or wetter conditions. And those conditions, as the environment changes, may have an impact on which finches survive, because they have different food availability of different kinds of little nuts or seeds, and their beaks have a range of variability. And you can see in this diagram that there's a range of small, medium, and large-sized beaks. And there's a few down here, finches, that have small beaks. And in the blue, in the rainy season, there's an abundance of those that have medium-sized beaks. And then up here, there's not as many who have large-sized beak. There is pre-existing variation in the population. But when it changes from rainy to dry, where the seeds of the plants that survive are much larger and much tougher to get at and to break open and eat the inside, the distribution of the beak size changes. And so that there's a large number here in the rainy season that have medium-sized beak, but in the dry season that goes down. And the peak distribution is deflected off here towards the large-sized beak. Okay? This is something we can see. We can measure. This is a measurable phenomenon. Now, the interesting thing is when the rains come back, the beak size goes back down. So in the case of the finches, there's no directional evolution. There's no enduring change through time. There's just a shift back in the variability back down to a medium-sized beak. So is that evolution? That depends on which definition, right? Certainly is microevolution. It's temporary microevolution. Changes in alleles for beak size that go back and forth. It seems to be what's called sort of a wobble about a mean, a regression back towards a mean. All right, so can a natural process replace the breeder? Well, there certainly was change because of the change in the environment, but it wasn't directional and it wasn't lasting. So probably you might conclude that that's not the same thing as an intelligent breeder. But nonetheless, Darwin called this natural selection, a natural process substituting for the breeder. Now, there were three conditions that are required for this selection to be real. Variation has to exist in the population, has to be pre-existing. Variation has to lead to differences among the individuals that lead to differences in reproduction. Okay? Not just a little change internally in one enzyme or another, or a little change in eyesight that doesn't change reproductive success. There has to be a measurable change in reproductive success so that that variation among the individuals can be transmitted to the next generation. Okay? So survivability to breeding and differential reproduction is really what natural selection is all about. But you need to notice what natural selection in this case did not do. It certainly didn't explain where the finch came from, didn't explain where the original variability in the finch beak came from. It didn't change individual finches. It only changed the percent of the population that was carrying a particular trait versus not. And that's what's represented in those shifts in the curves. Individuals make up that population, but they're individuals in the next generation who inherit traits differentially. And so it didn't change an individual in that generation. It changed the percentage of the total population that carried the trait. And it didn't create a new species. It was the same species. It just changed the beak size temporarily during a particular change in the environment. And it didn't change the finch into something that is not a finch. Didn't change the finch even into another kind of a bird. Okay? It was still a finch. It was a finch beforehand. It's still a finch after selection. Now, in textbooks, typically, there are a number of examples of evolution in progress, or observable kinds of evolution. And again, you have to ask, what definition of evolution are we using? So this example is well known. This is called industrial melanism, or the peppered moth, the dark and light forms of this moth, Biston betullaria. These are two moths that are common in England. And then during the Industrial Revolution, the bark of the trees in London, in England, got dark because of the soot, right? And so the idea was that the birds that eat these particular moths would have an easier time seeing the white moth on the dark tree than they would seeing the white moth on the white tree, the way the bark was before the Industrial Revolution. So the idea was the black moth would be picked off the bark prior to that, and after the Industrial Revolution, the white moth would be picked off. The problem was that, and that would change the frequency of the alleles. The problem is in this example is that the moths don't rest on trees. It's totally made up. It's totally pin the moth on the tree kind of situation. It certainly is something that could have happened, but the moths don't sit themselves on the tree like that as ready food for birds. But over time, the percentage of black and white forms in England did change. In other words, there was an easier time for those birds to find and see the one form versus another. And so the shift in the population occurred in the alleles for the color on the scales of the butterfly or the moth, and that was certainly microevolution. But again, this is used as a microevolution as an example of what could then be a cumulative effect of a moth changing into something other than a moth. So does the microevolution extrapolate to macroevolution? And this is macroevolution, right? Single-celled organisms going up through time, becoming vertebrates, becoming plants, becoming bacteria, etc. Can you extrapolate these small changes up through an entire billions and billions of years? I sound like Carl Sagan, billions of years, and come to a change, a complete change of body form, a complete change of organ systems, a complete change of life patterns, a complete change of breeding habits, a complete change of going from an egg, laying an egg, to a live young. All of these things would have had to happen, of course, through macroevolution. So the question, the real mechanistic question is the Darwinian selection mechanism sufficient to do this? Well, in 1980, there was a meeting in Chicago where the central question of this meeting was exactly that, was whether the mechanisms of microevolution could be extrapolated to explain the phenomenon of macroevolution. And the answer given in that conference in 1980 was no. This was published by Roger Lewin in Science, and I remember that conference. Because you'll recall that in 1980, they knew about genetics in 1980. And so this was part of the modern synthesis time period. And so they couldn't come to an agreement that microevolution was sufficient to drive macroevolution. And so I wonder if that is the case, I wonder if that's why, as we look at the fossil record, that there are systematic gaps in the fossil record between kinds of organisms. The family tree, as Stephen Jay Gould says, which adorns our textbooks, are based on inference, however reasonable, but not the evidence of fossils. I just need, this one quote is sufficient, because there's plenty of quotes about people who talk about the systematic discontinuities or gaps in the fossil record. They're well known, they're well documented, that there are no substantive examples of transitional forms. And Darwin, of course, was aware of that in his time, and his response was, well, wait 150 years. Well, we've waited 150 years, and we still have systematic gaps, all of which should have been filled in. So if there's no mechanism to change one organism into another, how could there be transition forms? So what we see as we look in the world today, we go back to what is it that are the data? What are the observations? We look around and we see plants and animals, birds and reptiles, and we look at their family groups. You know, birds are perching birds and soaring birds and hawks and owls, and reptiles for the company here for those of you who are herpetologists, and of course mammals. There's only really very few mammals by comparison to other organisms. But we know a little bit about, you know, what groups those mammals hang around in with other mammals. Where do they come from? Is it a tree? Is it a bush? What's the history behind those animals? Where did they come from? And so you can see here the branches of the trees are where the ends of the branches of the trees are where we have the data. Now, what do? We draw in what we don't know. We say, based on our philosophic naturalist interpretation, we say there must be a common ancestor. And so we draw a tree with a common trunk off of which come branches at various times that lead to the organisms that we observe. The problem is that there's no evidence for that. It's only speculation. There's no data. It's just not there. What we see are the living organisms, not the organisms that would lead up to these living species. Now, if we took a different interpretation, that is the more biblical interpretation, we can speculate that those branches are always separate, that it's more like a forest than a single tree, that there are separate lineages for each of those kinds of organisms. That's speculation too. But it's speculation based on the fact that there is no mechanism for macroevolution. There's no mechanism to accumulate the changes for microevolution to larger and larger changes. And the speculation is based on the fact that there's no transitional forms. Everything that's dug up in the fossil record ought to be a transition form of one kind or another. But that's not what we see. What we see is natural selection is a stabilizing kind of a force that conserves variation in a natural population, that keeps a natural population adapted to its environment and is not a directional force to move it in one direction or another.